2,800 years ago, someone buried 77 bodies in a pit beneath an abandoned house in what is now northern Serbia. And when modern scientists finally analyzed the remains, they discovered something that did not fit any familiar pattern of prehistoric violence. The dead were overwhelmingly women and children, and they had not come from the same village or even the same family. This is a Gomolava mass grave, one of the largest single-event prehistoric burials ever found in Europe. And the question that haunts researchers is not just who killed them, but why these victims were chosen. The site sits on the banks of the Sava River in the Vojvodina region, an ancient Tel settlement where communities lived and rebuilt for thousands of years, layer upon layer, and it was Serbian archaeologists who first unearthed the grave between 1971 and 1974, with the remains eventually housed at the Museum of Vojvodina in Novi Sad. But the bones kept their secrets for decades. It was not until a team from the University of Edinburgh and University College Dublin reanalyzed the evidence between 2019 and 2026 that the full picture emerged. Published in Nature Human Behavior in 2026 and reported by Science.org. So what do they find? The grave held 77 individuals packed into a space roughly 3 meters by half a meter. 40 children between the ages of 1 and 12, 11 adolescents aged 13 to 17, 24 adults, and 1 infant under a year old. That means 67% of the dead were under 18. Of the 72 individuals whose sex could be determined through a combination of osteology, ancient DNA, and enamel peptide analysis, 71% were female. And among adults, that figure climbed to 87%. Why does that matter? Because typical prehistoric massacres, like the well-documented sites at Talheim or Sparn, tend to show roughly equal numbers of men and women, or even more men, the demographic you expect if attackers struck a community at random. Gomolava is different. The researchers infer that the skewed demographics point toward deliberate selection, though they are careful to note this cannot be proven with certainty. Dating the grave required multiple lines of evidence. Radiocarbon analysis on 6 bone samples using accelerator mass spectrometry placed the deaths in the mid to late 9th century BCE. And ceramic typology from the surrounding layer supported that range, anchoring the event roughly 2,800 years ago. To understand where the victims came from, the team turned to isotope analysis, measuring strontium, carbon, and nitrogen ratios in the bones and teeth of more than 24 individuals. And the results showed diverse origins and diets, meaning these people did not grow up in the same place. Ancient DNA analysis on 25 individuals confirmed they were genetically unrelated. So this was not a single family caught in a raid, and it was not a local village wiped out in one attack. The victims appear to have been gathered from multiple locations, though researchers acknowledge the exact circumstances remain unknown. At least 18% of the skeletons displayed perimortem trauma, injuries inflicted at or near the time of death, predominantly blunt force wounds to the head consistent with clubs or slings, often struck from above and toward the back or right side. Some individuals showed defensive injuries, and a few bore projectile wounds as though they had been fleeing. The researchers note this is likely an undercount since injuries to soft tissue would not survive. Skeleton 42, for example, displayed sharp force trauma that may indicate an attempt to ward off a blow. The pattern, researchers suggest, is consistent with efficient and deliberate violence. But could there be another explanation? Earlier interpretations from the 1970s and 1990s proposed that the grave might represent a hasty burial following a pandemic, victims of disease rather than violence. But modern metagenomic screening found no evidence of pathogens, effectively ruling out that theory. Another possibility, that this was an indiscriminate massacre of a local community similar to what happened at the Bronze Age site of Kazas, is weakened by the genetic and isotopic evidence showing the victims were unrelated and non-local. A third interpretation, ritual human sacrifice, is hard to dismiss entirely since the grave did contain offerings including animal bones, ceramics, and bronze jewelry. But researchers point out that the defensive nature of the injuries and the absence of the kind of perimortem cuts typically associated with sacrificial practices make this explanation less likely. What does that leave? The evidence is consistent with, though cannot definitively prove, a deliberate act of targeted killing focused on women and children, possibly intended to destroy a group's future, its reproductive capacity, its lineages, its ability to recover. The early Iron Age Carpathian Basin was a volatile place, a world still reeling from the Bronze Age collapse centuries earlier, where mobile pastoralist groups and sedentary communities competed for land and power, and violence at cultural frontiers was not uncommon. The perpetrators of the Gomolava massacre remain unknown, and we cannot say with certainty what motivated them, but the demographics and the violence speak to something more calculated than a raid gone wrong. What we are left with is one of the most chilling archaeological discoveries in European prehistory, a grave that forces us to confront the possibility that nearly 3,000 years ago, someone made a decision to eliminate not warriors, not rivals, but women and children, and then buried them together in a pit that would not be understood for millennia. If this story made you think differently about the deep past and the methods archaeologists use to reconstruct it, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to see more videos exploring the buried evidence of ancient conflict, subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one.